Hello and welcome to JPod. This is a podcast on journalists and journalism. My name is Krishna Prasad and it's great to see you here. There are many politically incorrect things Narendra Modi has done in office and gotten away with. But none has been more questionable than inviting Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro as India's chief guest at the Republic Day parade in 2020. Bolsonaro, a retired military officer, had been in office for less than a year, but he had already acquired stellar credentials. A homophobic bigot with a history of misogyny who was pro-business, anti-minorities, anti-migrants, anti-environment and virtually anti-everything. Subhash Chandra Bose's grandnephew, Professor Sugata Bose, said Bolsonaro was a patron of death squads. India should not have chosen him, said Professor Bose, who teaches at Harvard, unless its objective was to show that India is a part of the global rise of right-wing authoritarianisms. Mahatma Gandhi's great-granddaughter, Supriya Gandhi, who teaches at Yale University, said Bolsonaro had much in common with India's current leadership, not least a complete disregard for democratic norms and the urgency of the environment crisis. But since Gandhi and Bose, Harvard and Yale count for very little these days, Bolsonaro came, saw, and went right back into the eye of a coronavirus storm, just like Donald Trump did a month later. Today, under Bolsonaro, Brazil has seen more deaths due to COVID than China. The medical journal Lancet calls Bolsonaro the biggest threat to Brazil's coronavirus response. But for the far-right leader who came to power using social media, the real problem is the media, mainstream media. COVID, he says, is a media trick, and the people will soon realize they were deceived by the media. Don't believe in the fake news media, he tells his faithful. You are an endangered species, he tells journalists. According to one count, Bolsonaro personally lashed out at the press 116 times last year. In Brazil, journalists are insulted, denigrated and humiliated by Bolsonaro and his sons every day by paid trolls employed by the hate office, their version of the IT cell. Reporters covering coronavirus have been confronted on the streets and stopped from doing their job by his supporters. Bolsonaro doesn't answer questions from media outlets that question him. He takes away government advertising from newspapers and TV channels that oppose him. Little wonder then, Brazil is 107th on the World Press Freedom Index. It is 9th on the Global Impunity Index. So how did such a man end up as the chief guest on India's Republic Day? And what does his advertised contempt for the media mean for Brazil and for democracies in the rest of the world? In this episode of JPod, I'm joined by Shobhan Saxena from Sao Paulo on the other side of the globe. Shobhan is the first Indian journalist to report from South America. He's now a contributor for The Hindu and his bylines have appeared in the Times of India and the Economic Times, among other publications. Shobhan, who has been based in Brazil since 2012, is also a visiting professor at the University of Sao Paulo. He gives us an insight of a country which, in many ways, mirrors our own. Hi Shobhan, welcome to JPod. Indian media has very few correspondents, foreign correspondents, and I presume there will be even fewer foreign correspondents after COVID. From your vantage position in Sao Paulo, virtually on the other side of the globe, nearly 14,000 kilometers away from us, what do you think is happening to the media in Brazil just now? You know a lot of what's happening here in India. What do you think is happening in Brazil in terms of consumption through newspapers, through TV, through social media? And have you had any sense of people losing jobs or salary cuts? What's really the scene to start off?
Thanks very much, Krishna. Thanks for having me on your show. It's a pleasure to talk to you all the way from Sao Paulo in Brazil. Let me start talking a bit about the media scene in Brazil in general. I mean, if we compare with India, the scene here is pretty different. Brazil is not a country of big national newspapers like India, which are published from 25, 30 centers. Brazil mostly has city-based newspapers, and the biggest newspaper here sells less than 500,000 copies every day. So Sao Paulo has a big newspaper, Rio de Janeiro has a big newspapers, but there are no national newspapers. Of course, there are
Right.
magazines which are sold all over the country. Uh, it is, I think, the main source of information news in this country has been television, and that has been for many decades, since the 1960s. People get news mostly from television and also from social media. Brazil has a very high concentration of users of social media, Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, and that has in fact become a main vehicle of news consumption in this country. Now, when you come to the present circumstances, the coronavirus crisis, as there's social distancing and quarantine being practiced across Brazil, of course, the level here is pretty low, with
Right.
only 50% people sitting at home and 50% people out on the streets or working. The consumption of news has increased because people are
Yes.
looking for authentic news. They're looking for analysis. They want to know what's happening, what's the nature of this virus, how it's going to impact their lives, what kind of impact it's having on the economy. So there people have a lot of questions.
Right.
And the biggest news the channel here, the TV Global, they've
Yeah.
made their paid channel free to public actually.
I see.
So the consumption has gone up very much because it's a very reputed channel. It is a most watched channel in this country. It's a quality channel. Of course, they have their problems with their politics, but their consumption has gone up. So they have 24/7 news only about coronavirus,
Right.
discussion, debates, top scientists, doctors, economists, political scientists talking about holiday, and people are really watching it and getting the information mostly from this TV channel and other TV channels. Of
Okay.
course, there's a lot of fake news and false news circulating on social media,
Yes.
on Facebook, on WhatsApp. So that is, so that's another side of the coin. Then on one hand you have good quality reporting and
Yes.
discussions. On the other hand, the stories
Yes.
like it's nothing but common flu. More people die of heart attacks. Nothing to
Yes.
worry about. That's circulating. So that is the situation here. As far as the jobs are concerned, yeah, Brazil had almost 12 million unemployed people
Right.
before the pandemic started. I think that number has gone up by 6 million more. So we are talking about 18 million unemployed people in the country of 210 million.
Yes.
Uh, if you're talking specifically about jobs in media, I don't have information because firing people here is not that easy. The
Right.
labor laws in Brazil have been pretty strong, have been made strong in the past 15, 20 years. So
Right.
firing people or even cutting salaries is not an easy thing. You have to go to the government, you have to go to the labor department. The company may even have to go to a court to get permission to do that. So
Right.
I don't think many people have lost their jobs as yet, but yeah, the economy is not looking good at all.
Well, I'm so happy to hear what you say about jobs and salaries, Shobhan. I know, but I was looking at some of these numbers. Brazil is this year 107th on the World Press Freedom Index, which is down two places from 105. This, of course, is not very different from India, which is 142 this year. Brazil is also ninth on the uh, Global Impunity Index, which is compiled by the Committee to Protect Journalists. I was seeing an annual report of the Brazilian Association of Radio and TV Broadcasters, and it says that there were 40 lakh online attacks on the media, 40 line attacks on the media, 40 lakh online attacks on the media and journalists in the last year, virtually 7 attacks a minute. Given all this information, and now that we know, what is the situation, how would you characterize the state of media freedom in Brazil? Despite what you say, how different is that state of media freedom from, let's say, India at this point?
See, the media freedom here is a tricky question. The biggest problem, if you talk to media critics here or social scientists here, is the concentration of media power in Brazil. Unlike India, where you have, I don't know how many, 250, 300, 400 news channels in many languages,
Mhm.
Brazil is a country of very few channels. According to a report by Reporters Without Borders, I think 70% of the TV news is concentrated in just four stations,
I
and
see.
TV Global is one of them. Unlike India, where the newspaper in itself is a business, I mean, here the newspaper industry or TV industry is owned by other corporations, other corporates, or rich families. So
Right,
they are just not in the business of news; they are in other business as well.
right.
And since we're talking about concentration of power, the TV Global is such a huge conglomerate. I think the only parallel we can have in India is the Times of India group because they have newspaper, they have a business paper, they have TV channels, radio stations, portals.
Yes.
And TV Global here is there's no limit on cross ownership. So they have many TV stations.
Yes.
They have newspapers, they have magazines, they have portals, internet. They're active in each and every field, and they have absolute monopoly on the coverage of football and carnival. That is the biggest industry in Brazil. So
Yes.
Times of India is pretty huge in India, but then they have competitors. They have HT is there, Hindus there, Express is there. They don't have that kind of monopoly which we see here in Brazil. So I think that is people don't really talk about it, but that itself, because they have such a huge monopoly.
Yeah.
And I remember, I'm taking too much time to talk about it because I remember I started my career in Times of India in the early 90s, and the editors used to joke, saying, "We are not anti-established establishment, we're not pro-establishment, we are the establishment." Yeah,
Yeah.
that's good.
Yeah.
So, that can be said about Globo here. It is not anti-establishment, it's not pro-establishment, it is the establishment. Is
Yes.
one network which sets the political tone in this country. They can pull down government. They can do anything. So I mean, so that itself is a problem here. The first problem here is the concentration of media power in very few hands. That is one thing.
Yes.
The second thing, what has happened in the past, let's say, 2 decades, is the rise of evangelical churches in Brazil. Brazil is
Yes.
the world's biggest Catholic country.
Yes.
Uh, if we look 30 years ago, the 80% of the country, 85% people call themselves Catholic. Now
Yes.
that number has changed dramatically. And now almost 30% people call themselves evangelicals.
Yes.
And the evangelical churches have become very big, very rich, and they've got into media. So some of the
Yes.
big TV stations are now owned by evangelical churches,
Yes.
and they have their own agenda, they have their own politics. So that is again interfering very big way in the organic politics of this country. That is second thing. The
Yes.
third thing, you talk about the threat to journalists. The as I said before, Brazil is the social media capital of the world. Huge consumption of media on WhatsApp, on Facebook, and it is also the capital of fake news in the world. In the
Yes.
last election in 2018, the biggest issue was fake news, and many journalists have written about it. There are many studies which actually almost prove that the current president, Jair Bolsonaro, he won the election basically because of fake news.
Correct.
And they have huge troll armies. They go after journalists who's reporting they don't like. Uh, there are not so many attacks in the real sense. I mean, people have not been attacked physically, journalists, but
Yes.
they are trolled, they're attacked, their reputation is damaged on Facebook and Twitter and WhatsApp.
Yes.
And so that is one threat coming from the political class, I mean the ruling
Yes.
class at the moment.
Yes.
The journalists who really feel um, are really harmed are those covering crimes, working on or drug issues or criminals. They
Yes.
often get caught between the crossfire between the police and the big gangs. Because when you talk about gangs here, it's not like the gangs we're used to in India. I mean,
Yes.
here the gangs have, they have machine guns, they can bring down police choppers, that kind of
Yeah.
gangs we're
Yeah.
talking.
Yeah.
So, there have been cases when a journalist has gone into a favela, a slum, to do a report without informing the drug lord of the slum, and they've been caught and killed. There have been
Yes.
cases like that, right?
Yes. Yes.
So this is a big challenge. The first one, the concentration of media power in a very few hands. So it doesn't have the kind of plurality we see in India.
Yes.
Of course, Indian media had a lot of problems, but we have still, in terms of language, in terms of reporting, we still very, very plural. Indian media still remains very plural.
Yes.
Um, that we don't see here. It's
Yes.
one language. Everything is in Portuguese.
Yes.
Um, so, and the concentration, that few TV channels and newspapers are too big,
Yes.
too powerful, and others are very small.
Yes.
And the entrance of evangelical churches, and again the threat coming from the politicians and the gangs to journalists. So this on, I think if you take it together, yeah,
Yes.
I mean, I'm not surprised that Brazil is very much low on the index of media freedom.
Yeah, that's very good. And when you say that 85% of Brazil is Catholic, and your leading brand of beer is called Brahma, it means a lot to me. But on an aside, it's good you brought up the issue of Jair Bolsonaro, because that is really the elephant in the room as we speak. He's been variously called homophobic, misogynistic, pro-business, anti-minorities, very right wing, far right actually. And according to the Knight Center for Journalism in the Americas, Bolsonaro personally lashed out at the press at least 119 times last year. And I saw that the Brazilian Federation of Journalists, the National Federation, has held the president responsible for 121 attacks, which is nearly 60% of the attacks which took place on journalists last year. And earlier this year, Bolsonaro said, "You journalists are an endangered species." So, looking at some of all of these things and putting them all together as we get into the meat of this conversation, from this distance, is this fair to say that Bolsonaro is a kind of the combine or the worst of Trump in the United States and Duterte in the Philippines, and maybe even a bit of Narendra Modi in the middle?
I think he's a bad version of Donald Trump. That you can.
Yeah.
I remember that says a lot. I mean, I remember a statement by Donald Trump. He was talking about his own Twitter account, saying it's like having your own newspaper.
Yeah.
And I think in that sentence, he just summarizes his whole politics, his whole attitude and approach towards media. The creation of social media has done so much damage to the mainstream media,
Yeah.
because the politicians suddenly don't need media, the mainstream media, to reach out to their base, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
and also they have decided to talk just to their base.
Yes.
It is happening across the country. So it has become a very big threat to democracy when you're talking only to a small group of people in huge countries. The other people do not matter anymore,
Yeah.
and that's how you take them out of the narrative as well. So this is basically a Trump model,
Yeah.
because I think in certain senses, Brazil is closer to US if you look at the how the society is organized. Very different
Yes.
from India. India is a very, very plural society. I mean, we have great variation in terms of languages, in terms of religion, in terms of regions. Kashmir is very different from Kerala. I mean, Assam is completely different from Gujarat. We have, so the American society and Brazilian society are more homogeneous in terms of culture, in terms of values. So it's much easier to use social media to create differences here and divergences here. So that is what is happening. He has been and the attack on the mainstream media, as the Donald Trump calls it, lamestream media,
Yeah.
is to get more and people on board on social media. I mean,
Yeah.
and now people, it's a fact across the world, maybe in India also, people are getting the news mostly from social media, not from the
Yeah.
sites or newspaper sites. People go, so and social media is not organic anymore. You
Yeah.
can put a fake story and you can promote it. A good journalist will write a quality piece, but someone writes a fake piece, but you put in few dollars and promote it, a fake story gets more traction than the real story.
Yeah, yeah,
So it has completely, I would say, ruptured the media narrative. It has completely ruptured how people get read stories, and people can't distinguish anymore what is real and what is fake.
yeah,
And that to a large extent explains the rise of Donald Trump and Bolsonaro here, because what happened in Brazil before the election, there was so much circulation of fake news on WhatsApp. And a recent study which came out recently showed that it was the fake news which basically swung the election in its favor.
yeah,
So if you win election on the basis of fake news, you rule also on the basis of fake news, and then you got to attack the mainstream media. And and so this is the situation here at the moment. I mean, this last week he was in front of the presidential palace, and some journalist asked a difficult question, and he asked him to shut up, not just
yeah,
once but twice. Just shut up.
yeah,
And that, plays very well with the base of the far right, racist, right wing group. They love it. They like it,
yeah,
and so this is the whole strategy. So it's basically a Trump model, I think,
mm,
because the Trump has almost perfected this model,
yeah,
using Facebook and Twitter to charge up his own base
yes.
and ignore everyone else. And we are seeing the same situation here in Brazil.
Yeah, in that sense, of course, he's closer to Trump. But what I notice is that every day, virtually for the last 16 months since he came to power, Bolsonaro has targeted journalists. Journalists have been insulted, denigrated, stigmatized, humiliated by Bolsonaro himself, and also what I read by his sons and ministers. And as you said earlier, Brazil has its own version of the IT cell, what's been termed as the hate office by Reporters Sans Frontier. And I was looking at something else, Reporters Without Borders in its 2020 report specifically says that Bolsonaro's reign has become synonymous with hate speech, disinformation, violence against journalists, and contempt for human rights. And therefore they also say that this is virtually ushered in a very dark era for democracy and press freedom in Brazil. you know when you see all this, when you hear all this, when you read all this, what really baffles me as an Indian citizen, despite all our plurality, etc., and our history, is that this very man was our chief guest at the Republic Day this year, despite all this extraordinary track record over the last 16, 18 months. What do you think explains Narendra Modi's affinity for Bolsonaro so much?
I mean, it's difficult to answer because if you look traditionally, Brazil and India never had very strong diplomatic or political relations. That thing changed in the early 2000s when India and Brazil came on together on many platforms, especially the BRICS platform
BRICS thing. Yeah.
created in 2009, G20, and Group of Four, Brazil, India, Germany, and Japan at the UN, the four big countries trying to join the UN Security Council, and other forums like BASIC and IPSA. So there was a lot of commonality between India and Brazil in terms of emerging countries, big countries with growing economies, and also countries trying to uh, to reach to become leaders in their own right, in their part of the world.
Yes.
So in early 2003, uh, Lula became the president of Brazil. And I think at that time, Brazilian politics and Brazilian foreign policy started to change in a very, very fundamental way. He reached out to Africa and he reached out to Asia. He went to India three times. He was very active in BRICS, and I think Lula was also invited as a chief guest at the Republic Day parade in India. And before that, Henrique Cardoso, who was president in the late 90s, was also invited, though he was not a known figure in India at the time. He was invited as a chief guest in at the Republic Day.
Right.
Now, if you look at Indian foreign policy to a large extent, we have been trying to copy what China has been doing, especially in South America. This is my understanding.
Right.
If you look at China, China today is the biggest trading partner of all South American countries, whether it's
Correct.
Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, it doesn't
Yeah.
matter which country. It is
Yeah.
is the biggest trading partner of everyone, but in South America, it has become very, very powerful. If we
Yes.
go back 30 years and 35 years, I think India and China had the same kind of presence in Brazil. So in 2012, when I came here, the India-Brazil trade was about $12 billion,
Right.
and they were talking about taking it to $15 billion.
Yes.
Today it's down to $7 billion.
I see.
Okay, so instead of going up, it has gone down,
Yes.
and the Brazil-China trade is almost $100 billion.
Yes.
uh, that's huge, you know.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think Indians have been. I meet a lot of Indian companies here. We have all the big Indian companies, IT companies, Wipro, Infosys, TCS. We have all the big pharma, Dr. Reddy's, you name it. They have
Yes.
very, very strong presence here in Brazil. They all have their headquarters here in São Paulo, and also we have the chambers of commerce, and we have the consulate in Sao Paulo. So they worry a lot about how to enhance, how to increase the business between India and Brazil to a large extent, because Brazil, despite all its problems, is a very important country.
Yes.
It's in terms of population, in terms of economy, in terms of size. Uh, just to give you an example, it has the world's 20% of world's fresh water is in Brazil.
Right.
You know,
Right.
and the just 18% of the land here is cultivated for agriculture. Just 18%,
Yes.
18%.
Yeah.
So it has huge amount of land here. So the impression of which I get that Indian government has been very concerned about. They think they're losing out to China. China is becoming more powerful in South America, and India is not able to engage with Brazil, other countries in a more meaningful way, especially in terms of trade. I mean, I go to a lot of these conferences here and meetings here and seminars here. The India-Brazil relation just revolves around trade and business,
Yes.
and to a large extent, to some extent, on culture.
Yes.
Because we have an Indian cultural center here. They have classes on yoga and Indian cuisine and classical dances, things like that. And people here really like Indian culture very much. It's appreciated very much here. So I think there are some relations at the cultural level. But the Indian Brazilian relationship is very much limited to trade.
Yes.
Um, it has not been a political relationship for a long time, uh,
Yes.
ever. But also because if you look at the Bolsonaro's politics, I mean his base is the evangelical Christian far right. That is the
Yeah.
that is a
Yeah.
base,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that is also a reason of his fight with the other mainstream media organization, because he openly supports the TV channels owned by evangelical churches.
Yes.
So, I
Yes.
mean, that's why he has created this fight. He is always attacking TV Global
Yes.
publicly. He attacking other newspapers, the mainstream media, but he gives
Yes.
interviews only to the channels owned by the evangelical churches. So very much like a Trump model, where he
Yes.
depends only on Fox News
Yeah.
uh, for disseminating his misinformation and disinformation or giving interviews.
Yeah.
That same thing is happening here. So I will say that politically, I think India. I mean, if you look at the narrative which comes from these far right groups here, they don't believe in any kind of diversity. It's a very,
Yes.
very, a very regressive evangelical Christian view. They don't have any regard for other cultures. And they don't have
Yes.
any respect for the cultures. And Indian culture will also fall into that category.
Yes.
Uh, because it's a different dealing with a different kind of mindset.
Yes.
So I think the whole thing about Republic Day, I've written about it, was focused more on trade and business, because politically I don't see any meeting point between the kind of politics being practiced here and the kind of politics we have in India.
Of course. No, I get that point, but I also see a fair lot of parallels between so many of these things you mentioned. But let's keep that aside. But let's come to the core issue here, which is COVID and the media. one difference between India and Brazil has been the extent of COVID and the damage it's caused. Despite everything in India, I think Brazil has had what, nearly 10,000 deaths. I think they've had more deaths in Brazil than in China, and yet Bolsonaro lives in some kind of denial. I think he's called it the little flu. He doesn't wear a mask. He says masks are for pansies. He's coughing in public. He's shaking hands with supporters. He doesn't believe in social distancing. He actually encourages people to defy these norms of social distancing by going to work and taking part in gatherings. I see that he has sacked his own health minister for his cautious approach. So it seems like, I think I saw just this afternoon that Lancet has the British medical journal Lancet has called Bolsonaro the biggest threat to Brazil's coronavirus defense. So how is all this kind of stuff playing out with mainstream media in Brazil? How are they looking at this? Are they as polarized as Indian mainstream media, increasingly has become? And what is the kind of critical scrutiny you think that Brazilian media is offering Bolsonaro, in the face of such very open defiance of everything we know?
If you look at the political strategy of Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro, there's something common. They make everything about themselves. You
Yeah,
know, so even with the coronavirus crisis happening, the way Trump is projecting it as if the crisis is all about to bring him down or to make him lose election. You
yeah,
know, this is a big distortion of picture, and it's all deliberate. And we are watching the same film being played here in Brazil as well. Very different from India. This
mm,
because it's almost the first case in Brazil happened in the end of February, and we are now in May. Uh, the president of the country has not even once said anything about people dying or people being hospitalized. In fact,
yeah,
when he was asked at a press conference recently, what do you have to say about it? He says, "So what?"
yeah,
He said, "My name is Messiah. That's his middle name, but I
yeah,
don't do miracles."
yeah,
I mean that again, people will try to look for some kind of method in this madness, and madness is simple as that. The whole idea is to keep serious questions, important questions out of narrative.
yeah,
If you don't talk about it, it doesn't exist. And in a very very cynical way, he has been trying to to weaponize the anger of people who are losing their jobs, who don't have money, uh, and he's trying to project as if he's talking on their behalf. He's talking about opening up the economy because people are suffering. He doesn't care about the suffering of the people. He's under tremendous pressure from the business groups, Brazilian billionaires who want everything to open as soon as possible. And so it's a very bad situation here because Brazil had all the time in the world to prepare for it. They have almost, the first case happened at end of February. China was in December, so they knew it was coming. Brazil has very close relations with Italy. Almost 30% of the people in Sao Paulo trace their lineage to Italy.
I
They
see.
have so many flights coming here from Italy. And even when we knew that Italy was collapsing, the flights were coming from Italy every day
Yeah,
uh, to Brazil. Nothing was done about it.
yeah,
And here again, just like US, we are seeing on one hand, you have the president who's denying that there's any problem. And in fact, he's not just denying, he is trying to provoke people to go out on the street and break quarantine.
yeah,
And
yeah,
there are some, and on the other hand, you have the state governors, especially the governor of Sao Paulo, João Doria, who's been trying very hard to, contain the coronavirus because Sao Paulo state is the richest state, is the biggest state, and also the most developed state in Brazil. So just
yeah.
give you an example, the state of Sao Paulo has more ventilators than Italy, actually. Yeah, the state of Sao Paulo has more ventilators than any European country than Germany, actually.
Yeah,
They have more ICU beds per person than most European countries.
yeah,
But it's also the epicenter of the disease here.
Yeah.
So we already have more than 3,000 deaths in Sao Paulo.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so when the governors started to implement quarantine and started talking about the seriousness of it, I think the president, he just diluted the whole situation, and he put pressure on governors to not to push it very much. So when you have this conflicting messages coming from the top, people really don't know what to do.
Yeah.
And and because of that, I mean, at least this is something I don't think has happened in India. Uh,
Yeah.
and we see a lot of people here going out on the street, going to markets. Of course, the restaurants and bars and pubs and cafes and shopping malls are closed here. The flights are closed here, but it's still there are a lot of what is called a fair, street fairs. They are happening. People are going here, and very tragically, very unfortunately, this all happening in the poor areas of the city
Yeah. Yeah.
on the
You know,
periphery, because there are people. Yeah,
yeah, I
you were
mean, I
saying
know,
something.
I get that point. I get that point. But I mean, I don't think any country in the world really comes across very well, barring a few like South Korea or Japan.
Right.
But that aside, I'm really very concerned when you look at it from outside that Bolsonaro continues, unlike most leaders, to target the media, and he just seems to be operating from a standard playbook of sowing distrust about the media. I was seeing that in March two times. Once during a Facebook live video, he told his followers, "Don't believe in the media," quote unquote. Later that month, in a TV interview, he says COVID is a media trick. And he says that the people will soon find out that they were deceived by the media. And even just last week, I was noticing that on the World Press Freedom Day of all days, he says that that he did not see the attacks on the members of the media at a rally he addressed the previous day. So it seems to be that continuously and constantly the refrain in Brazil seems to be to target the media. Why is this so important to him? I know that you mentioned that this will be that he's playing to his base and this will convince more people to come on to his side. But why is this so important to him? I know the elections are what, 2 years away from now, but why is this so important to him? And is this all working, this kind of repeated attacks on the media, attacking the messenger rather than addressing the message?
Uh, Last Sunday, he addressed some kind of rally in front of the presidential palace. In the middle of this pandemic, he has his supporters blocking road with cars, and they go to his palace. And he came out, and there were a few photographers from the Brazil's mainstream newspapers, and they were attacked and beaten by his supporters. And some of them were really veterans of Brazilian media. They're
Hmm.
badly beaten up, and it became an issue here. And I think a day later he called them for lunch or something, but he didn't apologize for anything. He tried to paint it as if some kind of misunderstanding happened. Now, if you look at the mainstream channels here and the mainstream newspapers here, they are in this situation they are doing a good job
Right.
of reporting about the crisis, about the economic side of it, the social side of it, and they are really doing good analysis, and that's exposing him more and more, showing how incompetent his government is. So I
Right.
think it becomes even he becomes even more belligerent and attacks the media more,
Yeah.
saying they're lying about it because there's no other defense. I
Hmm.
think the strategy offense is the only defense, and the whole idea is to make people mistrust the mainstream media and make them trust more what appears on social media, because on social media they have this huge troll army of
Yeah.
bots. According to a recent study, 55% of the people who follow them are bots actually. So
Yeah.
that's a huge number. So they
Yes.
can make any topic trend. They create hashtags and make it trend, and more people watch it. And because there's so much of information, people are not. I mean, this is a new form of, actually, in my opinion, a new form of censorship, when people don't know what is real, what is fake.
Yeah.
This is, you've already censored information. So this kind of politics which actually thrives on mistrust, on hate, on disinformation and creating confusion in the society. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
so this is what's happening. This has started actually a few years ago. Actually, it didn't
Yeah.
start now. It started 2016, 17, 18. We
Yeah.
saw how Brazilian politics was.
Yeah.
It broke down actually with the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff
Yeah.
and the rise of Bolsonaro. So this was all, there's nothing organic about it. It's all manufactured. So you manufacture an image on social media, and that leads to a different kind of politics. And now nobody knows how to control it
Yeah.
because it's certainly gone out of the hand.
Of course, the weaponization of social media is a global phenomenon, whether it's United States, Hungary, Philippines, India, so many countries, have weaponized social media in absolutely the most deleterious ways. In fact, even Britain. But, Bolsonaro stands out because of many things, I mean, I think one of the big newspapers, Folha de Sao Paulo, if you remember, just before the elections in 2018, revealed that Bolsonaro's campaign was more or less funded by corporates who had joined hands to feed this disinformation machine and to spread fake news on WhatsApp, particularly. So we know the backdrop to this whole thing. I'm very curious to know what is the role of these social media firms now in this season of COVID. How are WhatsApp and Facebook and Twitter and YouTube? How are they dealing with these things? I saw in one of the news stories that they'd actually removed something that Bolsonaro had done. I think on Instagram, some pictures and videos of him defying the social distancing norms. But on the whole, what's the role of social media been in this whole COVID thing? How are those digital influencers that the troll army of Brazil has? How are they distorting or damaging media outlets and journalists, Shobhan?
Yeah, I mean, there were a couple of tweets by Bolsonaro and a couple of tweets by his sons were removed by Facebook and Twitter. But I would say that was just symbolic because the kind of messages I receive on WhatsApp groups and I see on Facebook, the fake news is very much in circulation.
Yeah.
There's so many stories, there's so many figures about, as I said before, heart attack kills more people, flu kills more people. I mean, the whole idea is to make people. I mean, the whole idea is to make people question science.
Yes.
So the scientists don't know anything. The scientists are frauds. They're making money, and then there's stories about how China created it in a lab. So it is just so much misinformation and disinformation is being put out in
Mm.
social or in public domain. Also, I think YouTube is also removing some of the videos, but there's so much of the stuff already is there. I think they're removing maybe the 1 or 2% of it, not
Mm.
more than that. And if
Mm.
you talk to people, there are people, even some unfortunately in our Indian community who challenge this thinking that it's just something serious. Say no, it's nothing serious. Flu is more serious. Flu kills more people. So it's
Yeah.
also making impact, on people. And
Yeah.
because the social media consumption is pretty high in Brazil, very, very high. The internet connectivity is very high. People have got
Yeah.
smartphones. They get bombarded with these YouTube videos, with these posters, these flyers whole day.
Yeah.
So it does make an impact, and it is very evident because the the governments have tried to not enforce, but asking people every day to stay at home, practice social distancing. But even in state of Sao Paulo, which is a very developed state, it is as low as 50%.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in some states even is much lower, and the cases are rising. So you know that everybody doesn't need to go out for
Yeah.
work, and everybody's not going out to work. People are going out because there's so much confusion has been created by this messaging, or
Mm.
people seriously believe it's nothing to be worried about. And I think the social media, I don't know how the situation is in India, but here definitely they have not been able to check proliferation and dissemination of fake news or false news. about coronavirus and various aspects of this crisis.
Mm, mm, mm. Let's come to the last few questions, Shobhan, and they are to deal mostly with mainstream media. Bolsonaro seems to have perfected the art of playing one media house against another in this atmosphere to set the narrative, and like in many countries, he has his own favorite channels. From what I'm reading, one of the channels is Record TV, which, as you mentioned, is backed by the Evangelical Church. Uh, I saw at least one news story on Record TV where I don't know if it was the host or the owner saying that coronavirus is another tactic from Satan, that it's nothing to do with a disease, it's something that the devil has sent us. I saw other videos on Al Jazeera actually of microphones being snatched from reporters of Globo when they were on the street. So it seems to be that on the one hand, uh, a certain kind of messaging is going out through certain TV channels which are close to the president. And on the other hand, the channels which are opposed to him, like Globo, are being opposed on the ground by almost physical intimidation, not letting them talk, by harassing them, etc., etc. And I've noticed that he doesn't even take questions from some newspapers and TV stations. I saw a press conference of his where he did not, where he specifically named Folha, the newspaper, and Globo, and did not take questions from them. So it seems like he is very keen about this kind of tactics.
Yeah, I mean, again, going back to Trump again and again, as Donald Trump does in his White House briefings, he called certain channels fake news.
Yeah.
You know, so when he doesn't want to answer questions, he said, "You're fake news. I don't want to talk to you."
Yeah.
Uh, Same strategy is being applied here. Either you don't want to answer a question, you said, "I don't like question," you shut up, or you say you're fake news. So this is what's happening. I mean, um also these channels like Record TV, you
Yeah.
spoke about, they're also
Yeah.
connected with, there are a lot of evangelical channels here
Yeah.
in Brazil. A lot of them. It's like very much like the religious, spiritual channels in India, and they are throughout the day they're talking about different issues from their perspective. So I think it is like very much like US. It has developed an anti-science attitude
Yes.
in Brazil. And if you look at US, I mean the number of people who go to college, who have a college degree, is less than 30%.
Yeah.
In Brazil, that number is less than 10%.
Yes.
So you already have a very low number of people with higher education. You throw in the religious channels who are talking purely in religious terms, giving all kind of information which cannot be vetted by anyone.
Yeah.
And these churches have become very powerful in communities across the country. They have their congregations, people donate money to them, and so it's a very very complex situation. To talk about truth and facts is very difficult. So I think this attack on the mainstream media is part of that strategy to make people question these channels or newspapers and make them go more towards the alternative, which is
Mm.
basically evangelical church run TV channels or magazines, or make them go to social media.
Mm.
That's what's been happening here, basically.
Again, the parallels with India are so striking. I mean, it really baffles me. Each time you say something, I just seem to find some parallels here. I mean, for example, I was seeing again that Bolsonaro is using government advertising to essentially control the media. And I'm sure you'll correct me on this, but I mean, he seems to be, taking money away from media companies which are opposed to him and giving it to companies which are backing him. So it seems like a lot of parallels with India, even on this score.
I
Besides,
think I think it's all the common thread here is, in my opinion, Steve Bannon. It's all
yeah,
coming from Steve Bannon playbook. You
mm,
know, he has that connection with the Breitbart News, which is a completely far right media channel. Uh, like Trump also did, he stopped the New York Times from coming to White House.
yeah,
And Bolsonaro did the same with Folha de São Paulo, a
It's
newspaper
11
in.
o'clock.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so they cut advertising to TV Global, they cut advertising to other newspapers. I mean, it is being using the state power
Yeah.
to suppress media or make them dance to your tune.
Mm,
That is the approach. But it very much, even if these TV channels go soft on him, I think they'll continue to push them harder because, this kind of politics, which is the Trump brand of politics, they need to create an enemy every day. They
mm,
need adversary every day. It is not a politics where you see the other side as your rival, but you
mm,
see as enemy.
mm,
You know,
mm, mm,
everyone is projected as an adversary, not as a
mm,
rival. So
mm.
it's so I think Steve Bannon has been very active in Brazil. He's a personal friend of one of Bolsonaro's son, and he created this organization called the Movement. And one of Bolsonaro's son is in charge of the movement in South America.
Yeah.
So I think it's a Steve Bannon playbook which is being used everywhere. Of course, in US, of course, he's completely, but I see a huge impact of that kind of far right politics, which challenges the existing narratives and offers some extreme solutions to everything. That's
Yeah.
what's happening.
I'm very glad that you brought up the name of Steve Bannon because that's not a name much discussed in India. Although I've always wondered how it is that almost every right leaning country seems to be following the same tactics and techniques, the same playbook. So I've always wondered, and I'm glad you brought up Steve Bannon. But to come to the penultimate question, Shobhan, this COVID crisis has been the time for many countries across the world to trample upon basic fundamental rights and freedoms and sneak in all kinds of regressive laws. uh, and I believe Bolsonaro has signed something called the Provisional Measure 928 to deny information which was otherwise a fundamental right. How are Brazilians happy with these shrinking freedoms, and do they support this kind of stuff, or what is it that you think is happening? Is he just sneaking in stuff, seizing the opportunity, or is he paving the way for 2022? And how are the courts and regulatory authorities, do you think, dealing with some of these issues?
He has tried, but I can say gladly that on that front he has failed, and for two reasons. Because the every legislation has to go through the Congress here, the
Mm,
House of Representatives and Senate, and the Supreme Court here has been very, very proactive. For example, since the crisis started, Bolsonaro issued many decrees which called for, which sanctioned, the loosening of the quarantine, social distancing, but all those decrees were shot down by the Supreme Court.
mm,
Uh, Also, the Congress has been very, very hard. And so Brazil has a very strange political system. You will be surprised to know that the president doesn't have a political party.
mm.
So,
Yeah,
he got elected on the platform of a social liberal party, and then he left that party. So he
yeah,
doesn't have a party in Congress, actually.
yeah, yeah.
And he has not only, this is also something important, and this is something I've written about for the Hindu. He's having open fight with the Congress and the Supreme Court.
Mm,
So there's a
mm.
constant need for enemies, because the Brazilian Constitution guarantees certain laws, certain labor laws, certain health policies, which cannot be changed overnight. He tried to change them, but they all got shot down by the Supreme Court.
Mm.
Now, because his position is pretty weak in the Congress, he doesn't have many allies here, there in the Congress. He's
Yeah.
trying to find some new allies so he can make changes. He can bring out. On the contrary, the Congress passed several laws asking the government to spend more money for coronavirus crisis. The Congress passed a law which made it mandatory for the government to give almost $250 to all the poor families in the country. So Congress has actually put pressure on him to make some pro people anti-poverty measures, which he has done reluctantly because the Congress has passed the law. He can't do much about it. So
Hmm.
he's been fighting both the Congress and Supreme Court, and his supporters have been going out on the street and asking for the closure of the Supreme Court and the Congress.
Hmm.
This is
Hmm.
demanding that these two institutions should be closed down, and he should be undisputed president of this country. So we
Hmm.
are in that kind of bizarre situation here in Brazil, and luckily on the paper, Brazil hasn't suffered much because of the reluctance of the Congress or the resistance from the Congress.
Hmm.
We're not entered the territory where they can make regressive laws and make people suffer. But
Yeah.
these are very, very complicated and difficult times for this country. And Brazil really is at a crossroads where the institutions are in conflict with each other. All the four institutions, the judiciary, the executive, the legislature, and the media.
Hmm.
And it's the president versus everyone else. So we are in that kind of situation.
I,
A
I,
bit
I,
similar
I
to,
I
yeah.
actually don't grudge that. Actually, I mean, I think a fair bit of tension is better than a whole lot of compliance and agreement about everything. Because I
Right.
wish we could say the same thing about the Supreme Court here or Parliament here, and I don't think we are in that position to say that at all. But to come to the very last question, I'm sure in the midst of all of this, there must still be the so-called mad dogs of the airwaves. We've had a fair few of them in India who have communalized the COVID pandemic and so on. And have there been anything like that in Brazil? Have there been people who have said really the mad things, who have tried to set people against each other? Has there been any kind, you mentioned that China is very big in South America. Has there been any kind of very high level of anti-Chinese sentiment on the airwaves or in the newspapers? Has there been anything like that? Anything to communalize? Anything to, take this anti-China sentiment across?
Oh yeah, I mean, there have been some very toxic tweets coming from the top of the government. I mean, the top ministers have tweeted about China. The president's son has called it a Chinese virus, and they've done openly. And the Chinese embassy and the Chinese consulates have reacted very, very strongly. I've
Hmm.
never seen the Chinese diplomats reacting so strongly anywhere in the world. And in fact, the Chinese ambassador tweeted about Bolsonaro's son, saying that it seems he caught a mental virus in Miami. And they really threatened Brazil that if you don't change your behavior, you're going to pay a cost in as many words. I mean, and then they kept quiet after
Yeah.
that. So uh, the see and why this is dangerous, because Brazil has a very big Japanese diaspora
Yes.
outside Japan. The largest population of people of Japanese origin is in Brazil, especially in São Paulo.
Hmm.
And so, I mean, for an ordinary person, to distinguish between a Japanese and a Chinese or a Korean uh, is very difficult. When you brandish the Asians as someone as carriers of this kind of virus. So there have been some incidents. I've seen videos on social media, people going to a shop of Japanese people. There's a Japanese neighborhood in Sao Paulo called Liberdade, where all the shops are owned by mostly by Japanese. There are a lot of Japanese restaurants. So there have been cases here. People have been abused on the streets. People have talked to them in a bad way. So when you talk about racism or religious thing, it's mostly against the people from Asian origin.
Hmm.
Uh, that doesn't include the Indians. People from mostly from the East Asia.
Hmm.
They have been facing the brunt of it. But
Hmm.
the all the toxic messaging has come from the top of the government. I mean, that is
Hmm.
unfortunate. And they were asked to shut up and in no uncertain terms by the Chinese, and since then they have kept quiet. But it keeps cropping up now and then, and yeah, that's it.
No, but let me ask you one last question. Which does all this embarrass the ordinary Brazilian? All of these things that the president is doing in their name, does it embarrass the ordinary Brazilian, or has it worked to Bolsonaro's advantage? This kind of messaging, and do you think he will come back in 2022?
I think 2022 is too far at the moment, but if you go by the surveys, and they do pretty good surveys here, his popularity has been falling.
Mm.
Like, I think before the crisis started, 33% people thought he was doing a good job. That is now down to 26% or 27%. And the
33 to
people,
27.
yeah, 27. And people who think he's doing a bad job, that has increased by 6, 7%.
Mm.
He has very much like Trump, he has a base which is completely committed to him. The people who are belong to the upper income groups, white, conservative, they're with him, no doubt about it. So let's say that is 20% of the base will stick with him no matter what.
Mm.
And there's another 30, let's say 30%, which is completely opposed to him, no matter what. There's a big chunk in the middle which can sway either way, and I think that chunk is wavering. Some
Mm.
of them are going against him because, uh, people are consuming media whole day these days because a lot of people sitting at home, if not everyone, and they are not just watching what's happening in Brazil, they're also watching what's happening in other countries
Yeah.
like what happened in Spain and Italy, the countries with which Brazil has very good relations.
Yeah.
And they're also watching what's happening in our neighboring countries. For example,
Mm.
Argentina has just 270 deaths so far.
Right. Right. Right.
So
Right.
Argentina has managed it very well. Even a small country like Uruguay has 15 deaths, and Paraguay, all the countries, Brazil has borders with people are watching every day about what's happening in other countries because South America, all the countries are very connected with each other. There are no borders, they're open borders. You don't need visa to go to other country. And people, the Argentinian leadership and even Paraguayan leadership is talking about Brazil becoming a threat to them.
Mm.
So
Mm.
people are, people are talking about it, and this is, of course, making an impact on the country's politics. And I mean, if you ask me sincerely, Bolsonaro has become much weaker since the
Mm.
pandemic started. But that's not a good thing because the weaker he becomes, more belligerent he will be. And
Yeah.
he's not someone. He's not talking about a mainstream politician who believes in, making adjustments and compromises and reaching out to the other side. This is like, a fight to the finish approach.
Mm.
So the weaker he is, more aggressive he'll be, and then we don't know which way we are headed.
Yeah. So therefore, 2022 is too far away for you to predict. So let me just ask you this: since 2020 is still with us, and if you look upwards, you'll see the United States. How does it look to you from Brazil just now? What could happen in the elections in the US? Quickly.
I hope they have elections first of all they because as I look from here, they have completely lost control of the situation. The virus has gone out of control. It's spread very fast. It's the worst country, the worst affected country, and they already are opening up many states. So they are deliberately going into an uncharted territory where anything can happen. Countries shut down, countries like China or Taiwan or South Korea. They took very aggressive measures to check the virus. Now, the countries in the Western Hemisphere, especially in US and Brazil, they've not done enough to check it, and they're already in the process of opening up.
Mm.
So I think it can just be, everybody has been talking about it will be a different world when this is over, if it's over. I can't say anything about the world, but two countries I can definitely say, in one country where I'm based, and the other country which is not very far from here, and I've been watching very closely, US and Brazil are going to be very different societies when this is over because there's no political will or even a plan to tackle this crisis. And this is not
Super.
a virus we can take it lightly. Yes.
Yeah. Super. So Shobhan Saxena, friend, colleague.
On this positive note, we can.
Yeah. So Shobhan, friend, colleague, compatriot, and journalist based in Sao Paulo. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of JPod to understand a country which really people in India must look much more closely than China and other countries, frankly, for very many
Right.
reasons. too deep to go into here, but so very thankful to you for sparing your time and talking to me at such great length. Thank you very much, Shobhan.
It was a pleasure, Krishna. Thank you. Thanks
Thank
very
you so much.
much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.